Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining from different time zones. My name is Amr Salim. I'm a country engagement and the climate policy lead at the Coal Coalition in UNEP, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the third Cool Talk of 2025. Today's discussion focus on emerging solutions that are at the intersection of climate ambition, investment, innovation, and market transformation, cooling as a service, or so-called CaaS. As the global temperature rise and the demand for cooling continues to surge, we are faced with a dual challenge. How do we expand access to cooling without locking in an unaffordable or carbon-intensive systems? CaaS offers a compelling response by removing upfront capital barriers, aligning business incentives with energy efficiency, and enabling a shift from ownership to service delivery. CaaS opened the door to sustainable cooling at scale. While CaaS is gaining traction in other sectors, its application in the cooling space remains relatively new. Today's session will introduce you to the model, share early implementation experience, and examine what's needed to unlock broader adoption. Today's event is brought to you by the Coal Coalition Private Sector Working Group, which is convened by Danfoss, Metrus Energy, and the Carbon Trust. This working group is a global platform for over 20 leading businesses working to accelerate the adoption of sustainable cooling solutions. The group aims to help countries implement the Global Cooling Pledge with investable solutions. We thank our co-conveners for their leadership and invite other industry partners to join us in this work. Having said that, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel and experts. First, Bob Henkel, the President and CEO of Metrus Energy, who will deliver today's opening remarks and moderate today's session. Dimitris Karamitsos, Senior Energy Efficiency and Business Developer at Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, or BASE Foundation, who will share lessons from market adoption of CaaS. Shivani Mathur, Associate in Energy Transition at Amberside Advisors, who will speak today on CaaS contract structuring, scalability, and resilience through financial and stakeholder diversity. Andrea Voigt, the Head of Global Public Affairs and Communication at Danfoss Climate Solutions, who will present real-world CaaS use case involving cold rooms for smallholder farmers in Africa. Rhiannon Turner, the Senior Innovation Manager at the Carbon Trust, who will share lessons from award grant programs that support businesses in piloting renewables and sustainable cooling business models. Please join me to welcome our colleagues and our experts for today. For all of the participants, please submit your questions, any cue or comment you have in the chat window anytime during the discussion, and our experts will address it today. The session is being recorded, and a summary on the article and also the presentation material that will be shared. It will be shared with you in the coming days. With that, it's a pleasure to hand over to our moderator, Bob Henkel, to help us dive deeper into CaaS and guide our today's conversation. Over to you, Bob.
Great. Thanks, Amr. As Amr mentioned, I'm going to provide a little bit more context on cooling as a service, in particular, looking at how it's typically financed and structured, but also some of the main attributes of those types of projects. And just by way of background, Metrus Energy, my firm, is a developer, financer, and an owner of large-scale sustainable energy upgrade projects. We finance and implement projects through our energy as a service solution, and we're a proud member of the Cool Coalition. And we also made a $100 million investment commitment in support of the Global Cooling Pledge. So really excited to be here and eager for the panel. So stepping back and really just looking at some of maybe the origins of cooling as a service, I think it's helpful to think about it in the larger context of energy as a service. So energy as a service is a third-party project finance structure where you have an outside group come in and fund 100% of the project cost, own the assets, and then bill based on the performance of the project. And we have a couple slides here just to illustrate a little bit of the structure. But moving on to the next slide, looking at energy as a service, there's different types of projects and applications out there that have been in use, some of them for many decades in the energy world. So energy as a service can be utilized for broad-based energy efficiency upgrades, water efficiency, cooling and heating, of course, the topic of cooling as a service today. But it's important to think of cooling and heating in a couple different areas. There is the more distributed HVAC equipment that could be across a campus or a series of buildings. And then there's also more centralized cooling and heating systems, central plants that deliver sustainable cooling. You also see energy as a service in the renewable energy world and distributed generation. So solar PV projects, energy storage, and even electric vehicle charging. And the structure of how you implement projects is still the same, third-party financer and an owner. What really differs is how that service is billed. So for energy efficiency under an as-a-service structure, it's billing based on measured avoided kilowatt hours of electricity or therms of natural gas, whatever types of energy units are being saved. And for water efficiency, it's could be cubic meters of water that are saved from water efficiency upgrades. For cooling and heating, and we'll talk a bit more about this, it can be delivered thermal energy or thermal energy capacity. It also could be some billing based on some of the parameters or output of the cooling and heating that is provided to customers. For solar and storage, it's more of the energy generation. So kilowatt hours of solar electricity that are generated, storage capacity that's available. And for EV charging, it could be some type of monthly subscription or perhaps billing based on levels of charging. So under all cases, it's either a pay for savings or pay for performance. The project financing model that you see here is really the underpin for all the projects. You have a cooling as a service provider. They fund 100% of that upfront cost. They own the assets. They're typically entering into an agreement with the customer, the building owner, that talks about the delivery of the cooling, and it spells out how service charge payments are made, whether it's for delivered thermal energy, available thermal energy capacity, or any other key performance indicator. Typically, there's also a separate contract between the cooling as a service provider with an outside group that does all of the engineering, construction, and ongoing maintenance. So it's very much a traditional project finance model. On the next slide, it maps out just some of the project financing pricing structures that I think really make this a very flexible model and can help with its scaling. So for cooling as a service, it's often very common to bill based on $1 per ton of installed cooling capacity. You can also bill based on the ton hours of cooling that's delivered. Sometimes you can have a mixture of those capacity and delivery charges set up as the pricing mechanism. And then also in many instances, you can bill based on other outputs of the cooling project. One of the main reasons that a lot of customers are installing cooling projects, it goes beyond just having cooling. It can also get into indoor air quality and having certain temperature or humidity requirements that are essential to operate a facility, a hospital, other controlled spaces. And you can have billing metrics where the cooling as a service provider is guaranteeing that the cooling that's delivered is within a given set of parameters or agreed upon key performance indicators. And all of this helps just underscore the benefits of cooling as a service, which can make some more sustainable systems available by helping avoid capital expenditure type hurdles that customers have when they're looking to fund projects. It can be used through the pricing structures to tie the outcomes of projects to what really matters to a customer, which is the ability and reliability to have cooling in their building and to have it at agreed upon specifications. So all of this is something that I think can help grow and scale the use of sustainable cooling. There's also some financial benefits as well, in addition to the 100% upfront financing, since it's a payment per unit of cooling capacity or delivery often. That de-risks projects for customers. So the cooling as a service provider is assuming some risk. So there's some risk transfer benefits, all of which can help adoption and overcome a lot of the hurdles that are inhibiting the implementation of the cooling projects that are really needed at scale to tackle the climate change challenge and problem. I will now formally kick off the panel here. And as Amr talks about, we have a great set of speakers here that are covering different facets of cooling as a service and how it's being applied in the market. Each of the panelists will talk for roughly 5 minutes, and then we'll save some time at the end for some Q&A. So with that, Dimitris, we'll have you start us off.
Super. Many thanks, Bob. And thanks as well for the invite today to share some of our insights and excellent introduction, both Amr and Bob on cooling as a service. On some lessons learned, what we've seen on the market for cooling as a service, and I'll focus on large applications, and Andrea will share some insights on cooling as a service for cold storage. What we see with, if we look at the customer side, as we know, there is a large amount of pressure for customers that have existing infrastructure to retrofit their cooling systems. And very often that leads to price being, where customers being highly sensitive on pricing. So for a lot of customers, we do see value from transitioning from a CapEx to an OpEx model within cooling as a service. And of course, the advantage of cooling as a service is that the customer doesn't have to do any investments, right? So if we look at a larger scale model, which is close to cooling as a service, is district cooling. But very often with district cooling, what happens is that the customer still has to invest into the connection of the piping. And here really is the option to say, well, you don't have to invest anything. And in the contract, like you mentioned, Bob, there is this clear transparency on how much the customer is paying for a delivered service. So one of the advantages that we've seen there for customers is the ability to really forecast what is their OpEx into their operations. Because when they do an investment into an asset, into a new asset, there are all those uncertainties on what is going to be my maintenance cost, what is going to be if something breaks down, how quickly can it be repaired, is there like a solid supply chain for a new innovative technology that I want to deploy because I want to reach my climate targets. And so all of those uncertainties when a customer purchases an equipment tends to make them engage with systems that are less innovative on the market and potentially cheaper to purchase because they have all of those uncertainties. So they're trying to plan their expenses throughout the life cycle cost of that system. So we see that shifting to cooling as a service allows for customers really to plan this OpEx. And in addition, what we've came across was for large corporates that are under pressure to decarbonize, whenever they have to do a purchase of an equipment, they are requested to go through an entire internal procurement process that takes a long time. It can take sometimes 18 months or even more. So if they have to make decisions on what to invest in, very often, let's say assets that are not related to their core business is gaining second priority. And so all of this makes them drag into their plan to reduce their energy consumption. Because of course, one aspect is decarbonize, but the other aspect is this is having a large impact on their cost, on their day-to-day costs. So especially in regions where cost of electricity is high, and we've seen now also on our market in Europe, the fluctuations in electricity price, having a system that is highly energy efficient really brings this strong advantage. So for some customers that are also in that kind of segment, shifting to cooling as a service has been quite interesting. And one last aspect I'll mention, which is typically overlooked by customers, is when customers purchase an equipment, they are not expert in the cooling system. So typically they're going to engage a consultant, an engineering firm that is going to design for them the cooling system. And the business model of purchase is designed in such a way that that engineering consultant has to cover the worst case scenario, which is, let's say, a very high temperature or a certain amount of consumption of cooling. And as a result, very often it means that those systems are oversized, which also means that throughout the life cycle of the asset is operating on a suboptimal point of performance and therefore is even less efficient than it could be. And when you shift to cooling as a service, the entity supplying the service has the business incentive to deploy an asset which is just right in size so that it operates, let's say, on the biggest window as possible on the operating point that is most efficient. So as a result, also, when you look at the life cycle of an asset, which is 10 to 15 years, overall, the difference in costs are massive. And this is typically an aspect that is overlooked because a lot of customers, when they hear cooling as a service, they think it's a leasing type of model. And here really that's a differentiation I think it's important to bring forward. So the supplier really takes that risk to say, okay, in case there is a scenario where demand is higher than expected, as a supplier, I will take that responsibility to find a solution to deliver the right amount of cooling to the customer. So I'll pause here. I think I'm just at around 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. We'll move now to Shivali, and I think we need to have her added in. Is that correct?
I'm
There we
here,
go.
Bob.
All right, excellent. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning at some places. Really pleased to be here. And I think as Bob had explained about cooling as a service, and Metrus has given some key facts, I'll probably move on from that one. A bit about me, I've been in heat sector for 20 years, heat stroke cooling. Started off with the HVAC sector and then DESNZ, which is Department for Energy Security Net Zero in UK. Currently, I'm on secondment with Amberside Advisors, who are commercial and financial advisors. So the key thing now is how do we get the investment in? So lots of us, I think technology these days is not an issue. I would say chillers or heat pumps, green refrigerants, all are in the mix and well-tested innovations. Business models exist. Where we now need to get in is reduce the upfront costs, which I think we've heard a few times since the webinar, and get into faster procurement, commercialization, and make it easier to understand. I'm just going to unpack what Bob and Metrus said about leasing model or cooling as a service. I'll compare that to buying. So I've been born and brought up in Delhi. So air conditioning was, I think, a necessity, I would say. We needed it. So we had options of either buying an air conditioning or you lease an air conditioner or you just live in a building where you're buying cooling as a service. And for me, it's like buying a car. Upfront cost, I would go and give a check to, if I had the money at the bank, to the dealer and buy it, and it'll be sitting and I'll be maintaining the car and the expenses. Against leasing a car on a hire purchase and you get a new car, and again the maintenance is not your issue, and that's outsourced, but it's slightly expensive. And the third option is Uber. So instead of owning a car, I don't lease a car, I don't own a car, I just use the travel service as I need it, and I just do it on my app. Uber comes in, I have no I don't have to think about it using road tax or insurance or getting it changed, etc. And cooling as a service is exactly that for me. It is not leasing, it is not buying, but it is using a service and paying for the service as I need. The other advantage, which I think worldwide we are now seeing, is the grid reinforcement costs, which I don't think has been touched on. So it's a similar issue here in UK. With electrification of transport, heat is the next thing, and the grid is getting quite blocked. So how do we reinforce the grid? District heating or district cooling is one way of centralizing that and taking away those costs from a project. And that makes it much more easier from a perspective of delivering it as well. And the shift of cooling from CapEx to OpEx, I think we've mentioned a few times. The other things which also as a benefit, which I have seen and heard quite a lot, is from an investor perspective. So we've discussed a lot about from a consumer perspective, but what does that mean for investor? Why would an investor invest into cooling as a service? Few things: scale. So rather than me just doing one house at a time or one building at a time, I have revenue certainty for large ticket sizes, a strategic pipeline, which makes it much more attractive for an investor. Financial viability. So there are long-term contracts in this infrastructure game, which attracts the investors to put their money for a return, which they probably not get in a bank. So stable cash flows and de-risk of investment. Again, standardized contracts, which are now there in the market. Transaction complexity has been reduced, which accelerates the market entry. So lots of positives, I think, from both sides of the spectrum, the investor side and from consumer side, for cooling as a service.
Great, thank you. We'll move now to Andrea, who will give a little bit of, I think, some market context in terms of some case studies. So, Andrea, over to you.
No, I lost. Do you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Super. So thanks a lot for inviting me and to give some perspectives from our end to cooling as a service. As was just announced, my name is Andrea Vogt, and I'm leading Global Public and Industry Affairs and Sustainability at Danfoss Climate Solutions. Maybe just one word about Danfoss. It's a global technology leader for energy efficiency and decarbonization technologies. It's still a family-owned business. We have over 39,000 employees in the world, over 100 production sites. And heating and cooling is one of our business areas for which I'm working. So what I wanted to do here, normally when I'm speaking about cooling as a service, then I very often refer to a project that we have in Denmark on supermarkets, where we do have a joint venture with another company called Aneo, and where it is about providing cooling as a service to supermarket chains. And there we have super good experiences, also demonstrating everything that has been said already beforehand, and also working closely with Dimitris on that one. And yeah, a lot of the benefits of that project have already been mentioned. So I thought this time I'm going to speak about something else. This time I'm going to refer to a project that we are currently running in Kenya, in Africa, which is called Lost to Value. And that project is a 5 years project in Kenya, in 2 counties in Kenya, together with smallholder farmers and their cooperatives. And it is about providing those cooperatives, and via those cooperatives, the smallholder farmers, with cold rooms for their French beans, their snow peas, sugar snaps, and other local vegetables. So that project brings together quite a few different stakeholders, like the project owner or the project administrator down in Kenya, which is Danish Church Aid, then Danfoss as a supplier of cooling equipment and solutions for that context, and then also the provider of the cold room, in this case Inspira Farms, and then several local associations and specialists in the field, so that we really adapt to the local context. Right now, we have there are over 950 farmer organizations that are potentially onboarded into that project, and yeah, around 30-40 cooperatives bringing them together. So what is it that we want to achieve there? So first of all, the idea was to, okay, let's donate those cold rooms to demonstrate to the farmers the advantages of cold rooms and how it enhances the quality of their crops, and also enhances the conditions under which they work. That was the outset, basically supporting deployment of cold chain. But then very quickly, and also discussing with the donor for that project, which is the Danish government, DANIDA, Danish Green Business Partnerships, the idea was also to say, okay, let's not just donate, let's make sure that we participate in developing a viable business model for those cooperatives to make sure that they really endorse the idea of having cold rooms, and that they feel also responsible for those cold rooms, and by feeling responsible, even buy more into the benefits of the cold chain. And so thinking about this, we quite quickly landed on discussing cooling as a service models, simply because then the farmers don't just get a cold room, plant it somewhere and then say, okay, here it is, use it or don't use it, do whatever you want, but rather to say, here is the cold room, use this service to enhance your crops, and basically own it by paying for the service to a certain extent. And so we are still looking into what is the best way on how to achieve that and how to really make sure that it gets the buy-in by those cooperatives. But the beginnings are really very, I would say, very promising, because we tackle the fact that these cooperatives typically they cannot afford cold rooms simply from a capex perspective. They are interested, or they are getting interested in using them, and they need to get the guidance, I would say, to use the benefits they provide, and that's what we have started right now, with some good success, with a few cold rooms already being installed and running with this principle. The problem that we see, or that kind of emerges from this, is that if we want to replicate it, then, and if it is without donating, but really make it a business model, then the financial institutions who would provide also the capital for those cold rooms, they also need some security. And that security wouldn't, how would you give that security from a farmer cooperative perspective? That's the big question mark. And that's what we try to find out with this project. How can this best be done? That on the one hand side, we get those cold rooms installed and by doing so, support the deployment of the cold chain in Africa with all the benefit the cold chain brings. How do we make sure that the farmers are on board for that and use it and feel responsible? And how do we de-risk it for the financial institutions? So that's a little bit the overall context in which we are operating, and which we try to assess from different angles, together with our partners in Kenya, and together with the cooperatives and Dan Church specifically. To see what is the best way forward here. And I think what is really interesting, at least from my perspective, is the difference, the kind of philosophical difference between there. It is really about making sure that the cold chain is deployed per se. It's very basic at the end of the day. It's about making sure that we have a cold chain, and that this cold chain is as sustainable as possible, obviously, but it's the cold chain as such. Whereas, for example, in the projects that we are working with in Northern Europe, where it's about supermarkets using cooling as a service, and where it's about really having top-notch technology, taking away the capex and just making sure that this technology is being used immediately and then brings the benefits via the operational costs. It's a very different angle, and it shows for me the beauty of the cooling as a service in itself. You can, on the one hand side, you can use it to really deploy top-notch technology and make sure that that cooperatives like corporations, big corporations like Dimitris was saying, buy into such technologies and use them. On the other hand side, it can also be used for very basic issues like deploying the cold chain in Africa. So I think there is a lot that can be done, but also a few questions that still need to be solved. And I think those were my 5 minutes.
So we provide grants, technical assistance, and we share knowledge. And in particular, the grant funding enables companies to test business models and identify profitable ways of providing a pure product or service to users. And Inspira Farms, actually, that was mentioned by Andrea earlier on, was an early PRIO grantee. We've seen a number of cooling related projects within our program and testing a range of different models. And some of these are CaaS models, and I'm going to outline a few. So we've already heard a little bit about the agriculture sector. We know that food production has got to increase significantly by 2050 to meet the growing population. And for a range of reasons, many African countries are really well placed to play a pivotal role in the future security for food globally. But there are several barriers that restrict that potential, and that includes some really high post-harvest losses that we see in some places, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes of up to 38% for fruit and vegetables. And that contributes as well to the significant greenhouse gas emissions coming from the food sector. And of course, cooling solutions can help to reduce those losses. So to talk about one of our grantees, SocaFresh, who we'd hoped to actually have come speak to you in person, but unfortunately they couldn't make the date, which is why I'm here. But they're a really interesting company, and perhaps just doing something slightly different to what the project that Andrea's described is doing. They're also providing cooling solutions in the agricultural value chain, also in Kenya. But in contrast, SocaFresh, the company, is the asset holder, and it is providing cooling as a service to groups of farmers. Our grant supported it to pilot a solar-powered cold storage as a service, and farmers are grouped according to their proximity to a cooling hub that SocaFresh would have. But then a mobile solar-powered cooling unit would go out to collect harvest, and farmers are paid at the point of harvest. That's quite an important point. So there's security of income for the farmers. After SocaFresh have transported and sold the produce, the fee is then for the company is then subtracted from the profit made at the market, but then the additional income is then passed back to the farmers. And we've seen farmers' income increase by sort of between 20 and 40% within that system, alongside a really significant decrease in food waste, sometimes down to as low as 2%. SocaFresh also works closely with farmers to provide support on pre-harvest readiness and training on best practices and so on, to make sure that produce is gathered at the right time, because there have been problems where perhaps there was an example of mangoes being picked too late; they were too ripe, and that meant that the batch was rejected by the potential buyer. So this ensures that the intended customer will buy the produce and also optimizes the price. Now, interestingly, SocaFresh subsequently tried to do something similar in the fish value chain, also in Kenya, but this project didn't succeed. And this was interesting because it was found that the desire by the users, the fisher people, for the cooling solution wasn't actually there. The preliminary research had not given the right answer. Even poor quality fish, or fish that had spoiled somewhat, was being fried locally before it was sold. So they had come up with their own solutions to add value within that value chain before selling on. And that really underlines that desk-based research isn't necessarily sufficient, and it's really important in these contexts, I think, to engage with local users and their actual challenges in order for a business model to be successful. And then just briefly, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I just want to kind of talk about a different sector, turning away from agriculture. One of our other grantees, whose project is just getting underway, is a company called Drop Access, also based in Kenya. They are Kenyan-led and based, and they are developing portable, lightweight, solar-powered units for vaccine preservation. And they're called Vaxiboxes, and they're equipped with real-time monitoring and controls so that you can monitor the internal temperature of the fridge and be confident that your vaccine batch is going to be usable. And this importance of this technology can be seen in the example that we had a site visit to a prenatal care unit near Nairobi, and they had had a power outage for several months, I think. And during that period, the number of births in the clinic went down to 0 because there was no power. But in contrast, the vaccination program continued at the same level, and this was because the technology that they were using meant that those batches of vaccine were good to use, and so that really underlines how critical this technology can be. The PRIO funded project is a cooling as a service model, or an attempt to get this to work, to provide cooling units to health facilities, and they're accessing that at just $4 a day. And then that flexibility means that they only are incurring that expenditure when they're running a vaccination program. So when they don't need the fridge or the cooling unit, they can send it back, and they don't need that service. But the company has, as I mentioned, the project's in the early stages. They've reported challenges, and that includes developing that pricing structure that's beneficial both to the user and to the company. The financing that Andrea's mentioned, so to support procurement. So in this case, they're using the PRIO grant to support the procurement and the maintenance of the equipment. And then there's a program of education change management, because actually the clients feel that CaaS can be seen as like a perpetual lease. And I'm sure that this is a challenge that is seen in other parts of the world around cooling as a service, right? When customers are used to buying a thing that they own, a bit like your car example, Shivali. I think that's a really interesting example where both Drop Access and SoCo Fresh Fund, they really had to engage very closely with the end user. It wasn't enough to think, oh, we've got this great idea, we're going to come in and give it to you. They really needed to make sure that they were solving a real problem. And if they weren't solving a real problem, people don't want it, they're not going to pay for it, which is valid. And I think that learning can be taken back perhaps into some of the higher income countries where the technology or the type of technology that's being deployed is maybe different, but it's always the case that really addressing a need correctly with the right equipment in the right place is important to giving you a successful business model in this as a service way of doing things. So I'll close there. Hope I didn't go over time too much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're getting lots of great questions, and I'll maybe jump into one of them and steer it first to Demetrius and Shivali. One of the questions that was coming in a couple different places is, how is the financing arranged, and what does it consist of for cooling as a service projects? I think asking, what's the blend of equity and debt type of sources, and how is the financing being arranged? So maybe Demetrius, starting with you, Shivali, if you want to jump in too, and then others as well.
Yeah, with pleasure. I'll give one example, and then I'll let Shivali also complete. So, for example, one approach can be when an entity starts scaling cooling as a service, is to set up a special purpose vehicle so that the asset is not on the own books of the entity supplying cooling as a service. Within that SPV, it's typically recommended that the company still owns about 49% of that SPV, so that they can keep control of the structure in taking decisions. And an investor that provides debt into that SPV would typically require for the provider to have skin in the game. So to provide for projects that are assigned on that SPV, maybe 20% of the cash as a partnership together with the financial institution that is getting active onto it. Now, who are some of the financial partners that we see collaborating? It depends on the countries. Some countries are more ahead than others. Like, for instance, we're collaborating with an entity based in South Africa, where it's one of the local green banks that is collaborating directly with the provider. And they provide that debt with quite interesting, actually, cost of capital towards the provider. And in some other regions, it's energy efficiency funds that collaborate directly with the provider. And some of these funds provide sometimes even their own SPVs as part of the service that they do to collaborate with that private entity. So if we look from a journey perspective, if you are an entity starting into cooling as a service, we typically recommend either to go with an entity that have their own SPVs and then you collaborate with them on raising the capital, or you can do directly a type of sale leaseback model yourself with a financial partner. So there are different approaches, but it varies per type of project and the investment requirement and the location as well that it is. Shivali, maybe over to you.
Thanks, Metrus. I think I'll just expand to the commercial structure, which you've mentioned, and then some examples of the financing mechanisms as well. So I'll give a very latest example of what's happening in UK. We are regulating heat. Heat has not been regulated up till now, but it's going to be a regulated entity, which was passed in Energy Act in 2022 and then 23 in the bill. What that gives is a bit more certainty to the investors. So traditional lending instruments have often carried a very high interest rate. So that is true because it had to offset the perceived risks. But now with this certainty of the policy coming in, we are seeing the investors coming in UK PLC behind heat and behind the heat network developers or the ESCOs to address this. But we are testing in advanced zoning pilot programs 3 types of structures. The first one, exactly as you mentioned, a joint co-investment model, where the SPV is partially owned by the public sector and partially by the private sector. And that's literally to leverage the skills and expertise. Then you have another structure, which is called a golden share, which we are testing. So the public sector, where they don't have the money, upfront money to put in, but they want a seat on the board, get a golden share into that SPV. So not a seat on the board, but a seat on the board, but not voting rights. And that's another mechanism where you can actually just bring private sector capital 100% in. And then you have a concession model, a full concession model, where you bring in the money. From a financing mechanisms perspective, I'll go for the blended finance first, because I think it's quite interesting how you can combine the concessional capital with the commercial loans, and that lowers the risks for private investors. And one of the examples, and I'm more than happy to share that later if needed, IFC's scaling holding program, and that's a really good one for blended finance example. Then there's Singapore's green bond framework as an example. They've done infrastructure bonds and green bonds, where it's issued by governments or private entities to attract the institutional investors. The more traditional one is ESAs, the energy service agreements. We call it here heat purchase agreements, and cooling world is the other way. The ESCOs finance the infrastructure and they recover the costs through long-term contracts. The last one I would also like to mention is the climate-focused venture debts. So there are funds like climate investment funds, which can produce structured loans for these. So there are various options. And again, as you said, it's the landscape. So it's not only where you want to put the building in, but it also depends on the policies, the framework of the country which they're being applied on. Hope that helps.
That was great, and thank you for bringing in the topic of blended finance, which was another question. And yeah, I think you touched on a key point. There's different models. For more distributed models, I think you do see traditional cooling as a service providers have their own equity, and then they'll bring in commercial bank type lenders for the rest of the finance, and who will look at the credit of the entity that's receiving the cooling and finance it, and very much that way, and in a project finance type structure. Maybe one question I think for Andrea that I was seeing coming in, that was looking at how can cooling as a service maybe help accelerate the use of low greenhouse warming potential gases within projects. Do you have any quick comments there?
Yeah, I think I partly answered that in the chat already. Yes, of course, that's one important part of it. At least looking also at our project in Kenya, because one of the conditions or of the objectives of the Danida funding is also to deploy the cold chain in a sustainable way, and to, while you deploy the cold chain, to make sure that you reduce the emissions. That's the thinking behind. So of course, the refrigerants are part of that. In an ideal world, you would have then low global warming potential refrigerants in that cold room, and that would be managed very well and serviced and recovered at end of life, and everything done in order to reduce or to prevent the emissions. Unfortunately, we are not in an ideal world, and so right now the focus there, even though we have that of course in mind, but the focus is really to deploy the cold chain, full stop. And to make sure that we install those cold rooms, that we get the buy-in from the cooperatives, and that we find good business models or ecosystems, if you like, in the sense that those farmers also use the cold rooms and feel responsible for them. If this can be done with low GWP, then that's wonderful. But it's not, I would say, as harsh as this may sound now, I would say the refrigerant is not, it is important, but it's not the priority there. The priority is really to find a way on how we make sure that we get those cold rooms adopted and deployed and used responsibly and serviced responsibly. And that then entails, of course, also the refrigerant at a certain point in time. But there are certain stages to be just followed, I would say.
Sure. Thank you. Maybe there's one quick question that was addressed to me that I'll answer, and maybe others would have some thoughts. But there was a question about the dollar per ton of cooling capacity, and how is that set, and how does that differ when utilization of the cooling equipment varies throughout the year. And on that front, it's typically you're sizing the available capacity to what's needed at most of the peaks, or at least the base load. And that charge would be there and billed as long as the cooling equipment is available and that capacity is available to be drawn on. And then there would also be an accompanying delivery charge, maybe more $1 per ton hour, that would vary based on usage. So that's that type of service structure. I don't know if others on projects just have any comments about the types of service charge structures that you're seeing on projects. Maybe Demetrius.
No, excellent point, Bob. I agree with what you mentioned, and what we see for some providers as well. Let's say that approach is super important if you have like a very large investment into cooling as a service to do. So your investors also want to have this kind of fixed fee, so that it's kind of a way to de-risk the investment into the project with the provider. However, we know also of some providers that have a fully variable fee with their customers. And so the approach for them is they're diversifying the portfolio of customers that they have. So they have some customers, like, for instance, data centers that have really a constant base load and a growing base load of cooling requirement, and others that are volatile, like hotels or commercial buildings, which, for example, during COVID dropped their consumption down to zero almost. And so that gives them the advantage that when they approach customers, they really say, well, here you have the option to be completely flexible on your OPEX. But it is, of course, way more risky. And from an investor perspective, it's a risk.
Thank you. Maybe I'll open this up to each of the panels for a very quick remark, and then I think we'll move to Amr to close things out. But I'd say in many of the questions, there's a common theme, which is looking at the benefits of these projects to the users and really the economic case for them. And that's multifaceted. It can be, in some ways, looking at these projects from the savings that are generated by moving to a more efficient technology or avoiding certain other operating expenses. But there's also, I think, a broader set of benefits that go outside of those. And, how are each of you making some of that economic case? So maybe Rhiannon, just kind of start with you on the projects, just a quick comment about the economic benefits and case that you make, and then we'll move it to Amr and we'll go to Andrea next.
Yeah, I think our context is, for many of our projects, is slightly different because it's often about energy access for the first time rather than, or if it's not about energy access, it's about displacement of generator use. So it's a different context to the kind of economic case that you have to make, in the UK or in the United States. Part of our goal with our project, with our program, is to demonstrate that there are viable business models there so that follow-on investment will come. It is still a challenge in this sector, but I think the investment community is slowly waking up to the fact that there are real opportunities there, and we are seeing investment in pure technologies increasing. In Africa, there's some really great success stories. So I think it's a work in progress, but yeah, it's a slightly different context for us.
Thank you. Good point. Andrea, how would you sum up the economic benefits and the rationale for the projects that you're looking at?
I think as far as Africa is concerned, I think Rhiannon just very nicely summarized it already, so I don't have to add a lot to that. I would maybe briefly refer to the case that I did not describe very much in detail today, with our supermarket joint venture with ANEO. And there the economic benefit is that thanks to the cooling as a service model, the supermarket would use really technology which in normal times they would perhaps not install, because it's more expensive, it's super efficient, it uses natural refrigerants, it has all the monitoring features and so on and so forth. So it's really top-notch technology, which otherwise may have had a too high capex, and which, thanks to the cooling as a service model, will nevertheless then be deployed. And that, of course, benefits on the one hand side the environment, that goes without saying, but it's also economically, of course, interesting. It's economically interesting for the supermarket chain, because the supermarket will have low operating costs, and it is economically interesting for a technology provider such as Danfoss, because it allows us to play high energy efficiency components and solutions into the market.
Metrus, your thoughts on that?
Pleasure. I completely agree with what Andrea mentioned as well. And what is interesting is if we look at the pricing structure, which you shared, Bob, from a customer perspective, there is, like we mentioned, this clear transparency. But from the provider perspective, there is actually an incentive business-wise to continuously increase energy efficiency within an existing contract. So that means we're really shifting an economical model from selling spare parts, which today a lot of companies based their business on, towards actually increasing value to an end customer, really increasing this level of what we call systemic efficiency. And so that really also engages nicely with a circular economy type of approach, where we don't rely so much anymore on what materials we can sell to a customer, but really what's the value we can deliver to a customer.
Shivali, why don't you close it out, and then we'll hand it over to Amr.
I'll give one example on this one. So I'm working on a project currently, and we're looking at a 5G district heating cooling system. And it's quite interesting because we are proposing, and the current feasibility report is based on how you can make revenue both from heating and cooling. So the waste of the system is being provided as a revenue stream. So there are different ways that the charging mechanisms can be done. And we've simulated financial scenarios of making the fixed and the variable charges quite differently. So you can have a connection charge, then you can have a fixed tariff and a variable tariff, both on heating and cooling. But it's that beauty of how do you get it right, both for the consumer and for the investor, is I think the magic of the contract. But it's quite interesting, and definitely there's value. And the last thing is flexibility. I know we haven't mentioned it throughout the conversation, but to me, it's a big thing, balancing the load and creating value from flexibility, which is very difficult to monetize currently. But I think we'll get there to a model.
Driven by necessity, I guess we'll get there.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks to all the panelists for their thoughts and answers to the questions here. And Amr, to you to close us out.
Thank you very much, Bob, and everyone. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Rihanna. Thanks, Shivali. Thanks, Metrus, for all of your insights. I see it has been very useful and insightful. The level of engagement from all of participants demonstrate the need and necessity to understand this more and have more interactive discussions. That's why I would like really to encourage all of the other organizations, if you are really interested in taking part in this working group, please email my colleague Marisuf or myself. We're gonna place our emails, and we will be also in touch with you with the material that Bob already presented and the recording, as well as also how to join the working group if you're interested. So I highly really invite you to join this working group to discuss further about the cooling as a service and other technology as well at the scale. But today was really useful, so I couldn't really be more grateful for all of the experts and you also as participants to make it more interactive. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank my colleague Mary Sophie for organizing all of that, along with Shika, Basin, my colleagues. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the next cool talks. Bye bye. Ciao.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.